Hello. In November 2023, I was honored to give a memorial lecture for the artist Judith Tucker at the Paul Mellon Center. I'm doing a second part of this because within the time scale, I wasn't able to do justice to a major area of Judith Tucker's work from 2011, 2013 onwards. So for a period of 10 years, when Judith Tucker worked very closely with the free form poet, British poet Harriet Tarlow. And the themes of On the Edge, in the Place, with the Earth took a different direction. And so I'm doing a second part of this lecture to do justice within it. In the first part of the lecture, I made very fleeting reference to the titles of Judith Tucker's series called The Fitties, The Night Fitties, with which she was preoccupied in the last 10 years of her life. And I indicated that these were words that had been picked up and spoken by people who lived in these particular kinds of holiday cottages in the Lincolnshire coast. But I was inaccurate. And so this lecture is to correct and give depth to the sense of the way in which words and images, poetry and painting relate in the larger context of Judith Tucker's engagement with landscape, with place, on the edge, in the place, with the earth, but particularly with the earth in terms of a development of a kind of ecologically critical painting practice, which intersected very intimately with the work of Harriet Tarlow, a British poet and writer who comes from a tradition of engagement with both free-form poetry, modernist poetry. Particularly, she did her PhD on HD, Hilda Doolittle, the very brilliant British poet, but also was concerned with the issues of the spacing, the placing, the physical, the visual aspects of published poetry, as we shall see. So in the first lecture, just to review very gently, I was conveying something about, or at least asking myself, how would we plot out the trajectory of Judith Tucker's painting practice and drawing practice from her training as a painter at Ruskin College in Oxford to her independent practice for 10 or 15 years after she left college to her undertaking an MA and a PhD in fine art at the University of Leeds. And we see this is the work that was submitted for a PhD under the title Caesura, kind of break, a shift, concerned very much with practices based on going to the place, drawing in the landscape very much, but capturing through forms that were very painterly, very material, and to some extent abstract, the flows, the movements, the shifts, the geology, the structure. But then a second major series that she undertook took her to the place, which was in fact to the beaches of northern Germany, where at first she explored the possibility of sand and sea and sky until she was arrested by a particular object, a kind of beach basket, literal translation from the German Strandkorb, in which she was initially interested by seeing these beach baskets, but recognizing their presence in the album, the photo album, the family photo album from the 1930s, when her mother, the child on the left, and her grandmother were on holiday in a place called Albeck on the Baltic coast of northern Germany. But in 1930, that's a few years before, as Jewish Germans, they would have ceased to be allowed to be on this beach. And Judith Tucker returned with these memory images. So her interest at this point was landscape and memory rather than geological formation and the forces of nature. And we have these monumental and beautiful drawings in black and white, as well as paintings in which the beach basket with its distinctive stripes are present. Now, She went on then to follow through with her interest in the family album, in these works in a series in 2008 called Tents, when she went to what she called the Lido in the forest, which was called Friedrichrode in Thuringia, Germany, where her mother had learnt to swim. But she discovered while there that in the nearby to where her mother was learning to swim, in a pool that she was soon not to be allowed to swim in, the Olympic team of the Third Reich was training, and she found some archive images of the processes by which this was being prepared. So this became a kind of a tense moment of the relationship between the vulnerable child learning to swim in one Lido while something else was happening really nearby. So I was an overall trajectory of the lecture was to go from the early work, the caesura, through the being working with the family album with the question of memory, which is obviously tinged with the sense of the forced escape of the German Jewish family of her mother to England under the growing pressure of the persecution of all German Jews and ultimately all Jews of Europe under the Third Reich. So there's a displacement that happens, which makes this memory work. But when we look at this kind of work, it belongs in a moment of engagement with post-memorial landscapes, the question of the family album, and particularly preoccupations with the legacies transmitted through families, through unspoken or through images, what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory, to children who grew up in relative safety in Britain, this question of transmitted trauma as well as acquired memory mediated by the photograph. And how do we go from the kind of caesura type abstraction, with which she first explores the Strandkorb, to something as stunning as this central image, which was crucial to my lecture because it brought in not just post-memory, but a different kind of Holocaust haunting, which is both conscious and unconscious as it finds a form to kind of bring the past into the present. It's not just going back to the past or going back to the place, but these are very present and lived forms of carried memory, transmitted trauma, but also warnings that need to be considered. And the centrality of as this particular painting you see in the middle here, it's not a simple question of finding a motif from the family album and then seeing them on the beach, but creating a remarkable, almost history painting of how the everyday is haunted by the horror. And this is indexed by aspects of this composition. I talk about it more in the lecture, but also at the point at which the stripes of the holiday beach baskets become sinister bearers of other memories of the concentration camps, uniforms, but also in a sense of the trains, of the transports, and of the terrible, terrible and unspeakable losses. But then how do we get to the image on the right, the last great series of Judith Tucker's work, Night Fitties, called Hideaway Here, dated 2022, which are phenomenally painted landscapes of the North Lincolnshire coast, where a kind of cluster of makeshift cottages and old barracks, some caravans as well, cluster on an edge of the coast and the area called the salt marshes, or that they are salty and therefore can't be used for agriculture and was used in the war and before the war for holiday makers who had no other ways. They arrived in camps. So why are these lovely holiday landscapes with the waving grasses and the dunes and these cottages with interiors that you can see of coziness? How do they relate? And I was making an argument of the ways in which this traumatic memory infused and gave a certain tone to these works called the Fitties. But in the course of the lecture, I didn't adequately draw attention to the correlation between these paintings, even as a trajectory in Judith's work, the intersection with her work with Harriet Marlowe, the poet. So here's the painting called A Night Fitties, which is these the Fitties as the salt marshes on Lincolnshire. So these are paintings of the little clusters at night. And this is being exhibited at the moment by Hacklebury Fine Art. And here you see it in the corridor, much more beautifully catching the extraordinary colors of it than this larger scale image. But the title is A Full Day Out for Next to Nothing. Now, it is this question of what is the relationship between the series, Night Fitties, and the titles that I wish to explore in this lecture. So we have paintings with titles like Everyone's Walking Past, Hideaway, or I Only Come Here When the Weather's Good. And where did these come from? Well, we start to get a different sense of that when we look at the ways in which the paintings were exhibited in exhibitions of joint exhibitions of Harriet Marlowe and Judith Tucker, because both, one as a poet, one as a painter, worked side by side on the Lincolnshire coast, as they had worked side by side in many other areas of landscape, as you will see earlier in their collaboration. And you can see that the installation is a double installation. It's an installation of paintings and of poetry. Poetry, not taking the forms of structured poetry, but it's free form poetry, which originates in early 20th century experimental poetry and the kind of expansion of the form poetry, which doesn't go with rhyme and meter and the usual structures, but assonance and certain ways in which language and catches something more of the rhythm of spoken language. Built through certain kinds of words, and we will hear it spoken by Harriet Marlowe as you go on, but starry cold, rosehip stunned to white, flickery chains draw roofs, acrylic reindeer grazes, LED out front. These are captured words from observation of the communities who spend their summers and sometimes live at longer term in these chalets, these holiday cottages on the coast of Lincolnshire, the Fitties. But if you look at some of the poets, prow push to shove fence out, Leilandi up and round, or sunset silhouettes, windmill girders. There's a lot to do with assonance to words, to repetitions, to hearing it in a way that is not based on, as I say, meter, rhyme, and speak, but more like speech. And the picture I showed you before here is shown again, but what is interesting here now is the format here is the space of the distribution of the image and the words becomes calculated to, as it were, to make these work together. And this is one of the longer versions of the kinds of poems that you see attached when we see the exhibition. This is in 2021, an exhibition in Scunthorpe, as it's sent. And so these are poems cull or created from overhearing conversations working, but they're very worked out. They're not just casual words. And it was this that I needed to research to understand. So it takes some time to hear the structures. So, for instance, you could shove a chalet up willy-nilly in the 40s. I were 5, tilly lamps hissed. So there's some willy-nilly tilly lamps hissed, water on a pump, 2 metal buckets if you were strong enough. My granddad would big up 3 bits of wood back from the docks. It were a chalet. This one's got 3 roofs on it. Used to be a flat roof, then somebody put a sloping roof, then another one. It never leaks, to be fair. There's birds in the roof, we leave them there. It never leaks, to be fair. We leave them there. we leave them there. They were here before us. We're all very close around here. We walk around in our dressing gowns, help with building always a cuppa. We hut dwellers look after each other. We took that insult and used it back. Why destroy a thing of beauty? So you can see how they experimented with this set of relationships between words and image. So let's talk a bit about Harriet Tarlow. Harriet Tarlow did a BA and a PhD in creative writing and poetry at University of Durham. She's now professor of eco-poetry and poetics, and her PhD was on the freeform modernist poet H.D. You can see a number of publications of her poetry, including the most recent, but the book Gathering Grounds is the long form of the poems that became part of the collaboration over the 50s between Judith Tucker and Harriet Tarlow. And there's a reference here for anybody who's interested. She says she has three main areas of interest within writing poetry and writing, obviously, poetry criticism as a professor of this, as well in both a creative professor and an academic professor, which are gender, landscape, and environment, eco-criticism, and experimentalism and avant-gardism. But she's also interested in performance and poetry readings, and therefore very much the question of the voice, but also in terms of poetry is a question of the page and the image, as it were, of words on the page, the placement and space. So I quoted this one, but here you can see Judith Tucker's title is Night Fitties Nothing Was Here, It Was All Open to the Beach, which comes from not conversation and overheard words, but the weaving of overheard words and references into a new form of poetry. We mentioned Wise Destroy a Thing of Beauty, which is a work that was shown at the Hacklebury exhibition in 2022 to 23. The poem, this is a small part of the poem, we gutted it and done it all ourselves, made this garden from rubble, from nothing. There's a lot, live here full time. We're all very close here. We walk around in dressing gowns, help with building, always a cuppa. We hut dwellers look after each other. We took that insult, used it back. Why destroy a thing of beauty? So these are not explanatory, but they are echoes of conversations and engagements with the people who live in this particular area, with this community of which Judith Tucker and Harriet Tarlow eventually became members, buying a chalet within this community. I Only Come Here Whether the Weather's Good is the title of this wonderfully somber and fascinating painting. It starts, I only come here when the weather's good. I've been more than this year than never before, but my wife's been poorly, throat cancer, you know. After all the treatment, the chemo, we came. My traveling days are long gone, and the fresh air helps her breathe easier. We've looked at this one, Nothing Was Here. It was all open to the beach. The cousins and I grew up on the sand dunes. I love the planes going over. They've always been here. They flew much lower then, and we used to wave, and they waved back and everything. We'd go out to the forts along the boom. You knew where you were and how long you had exactly when the boom was there, till they took it away. It's the love of my life, really. So what we're looking at is a particular collaboration of visual art and word art, painting and poetry, that Judith Tucker and Harriet Tarlow understood, which is also Harriet Tarlow and Judith Tucker in terms of their respective institutions. Landscape, place, eco-critical aesthetics, and walking brought them together. And walking is a very crucial part because the ways in which they participated in the landscapes that they came to write poetry about, with, or in, and work on in terms of drawing. You see them sitting, Judith Tucker watching with her hand in her on her notebook, and Harriet Tarlow looking as well, but also with her little notebook in which to begin to find the words from which she would compose her poems. Now, they collaborated on a series of beautiful books together: Never Ends, Poems and Paintings; Outfalls, Poems and Drawings; Behindland, Poems and Paintings; Sound Unseen, Poems and Drawings. And if you look at the 34 pages, 16 pages, 36 pages, many of them are published by the Pansy Press, which is an art press from the University of Leeds. And they are very specific books. So this is Outfalls, Poems and Drawings. Sorry, I may have to go back one. Yeah, Outfall, Poems and Drawings. And on the left, you see Highbridge 2017, and on the right, Green on Green 2017, charcoal drawings, varnish and white pigment on Arches paper. These are extraordinary physical, material, fascinating drawings, and Judith Tucker was an extraordinary we don't have a word for a draw artist, for an artist who draws. I always think, they're not a draftsman or a draftswoman, they're not an artist in black and white, whatever. We don't understand this extraordinary fundamental element of drawing enough to give it a proper name, because it's not a designer nor a drawer. But the physical quality, as you can see from the ways in which she works, the textures of the paper to create the textures. And here she's using the non-landscape format, the horizontal as opposed to the landscape format, for these studies of outfalls of various parts of the canals and landscapes of the area. And you have a fragment of a poem by Harriet Tarlow: cut banks out water, capture course, land capture course, land, water. Let it in, let in, let out, low line, land cut line, strip sky. It's listening for the letters of the word, for the sound of words, for the repetitions, for something else other than the formal things. So sorry, go forward. And when they get made into books, we have the black and white of the drawings, the black and white of the words on the page, but also you can see the disposition of the words on the page constitute their own visuality. So the question of how poetry or printed words, as it were, can themselves capture the notion of space, but equally capture the notion of the movement through this. So going back to the image of their walking through the landscapes, arriving at places, settling down, watching, and the time it takes, in a sense, for a drawing to develop from sketches or be developed from sketches, is to kind of create something on the page. But at the same time, when you set the poem on the page, there is another kind of drawing, an inscription, a play of space and blank and placement and composition as they echo each other. We see here two other drawings of this kind, and again a fragment from Harriet Tarlow's poem: cracked coping stone held heavy up by brick and wire, empty where gates hung, but still canalized streams ever over, growing edge aslant. And when the outfalls were exhibited at the Groundwork Gallery in King's Lynn, this a terrible photograph, but nonetheless you get a sense of different ways in which these integrate and punctuate each other with these different forms of visuality and space and placement. When they came to publish the books, they're published in a way to create book forms that can interlace the density of the page as it's covered with the marks that Judith Tucker makes, bringing us in a sort of very modernist sense to the materiality, the materialization that's involved in any act of making art, but also interspersing it with the poetic state. Sound and scene, again, a different form, and this is when she's using the landscape format as opposed to that. This is the one that shows you the some aspects of the fitties. And I show you these again to insist upon the visuality of the writing and in a sense the graphic of the artwork. These remarkable these works, long and thin works by very much on the landscape format um, by Judith are in extraordinary development of the kind of quality of painting, the quality of texture and materialization and medium as she uses it in the drawings now come to be infused with color as she explores these other landscapes of the area. And you can see once again the juxtaposition of the two, the integration of the word and the image. The final stage I want to talk about is their collaboration, still engaging with the area around where the fitties of the salt marshes on the Lincolnshire coast, but an increasing awareness of eco-critical new materialist kind of ways of thinking and the preoccupation with not human habitation or human intervention in the landscape or the kind of memorial and the consciousness that comes from people that's registered in the words, the listening to the words in the speaking, is the question of plants. Now, when Judith Tucker first told me she was interested in plants and invited me to an exhibition she was curating on plants in Huddersfield and painters who engaged with that, I have to say I was perplexed. The painting of plants, flowers, yes, and indeed. And then I used my feminist art history to go back and think, of course, some of the most important women painters in the history of art have not just been landscape painters, but been flower painters, but not flower painters in terms of decoration, but often very scientific, like Sibylla Merian, who was one of the people. She went off to one of the parts of the northern coast of Latin America that was part of the Dutch Empire, and studied the kind of the plant forms there and became one of the most extraordinary illustrators and representatives of plant forms, but in the process discovered aspects of the life of plants, the processes of their generation, the different phases, but also in doing so, she was one of the first people to observe metamorphosis in the form, for instance, from larvae to grubs to butterflies. So became part of a sort of 16th, early 17th century scientific observation of nature. Um, so and then there's Rachel Reich. I mean, the whole great generation of Dutch not landscape, flower painting, which is such an important part of 17th century Dutch art because they're exploring not just the beauty of bulbs, but they're showing particularly the discovery of exotic plants that were brought from the different kind of colonial outposts and trading outposts, including the tulip, which became such a major force in the economy of the Netherlands and indeed a very extraordinary economic collapse that was resulted from it. So this long history of science and art and a sense of life processes is not confined to some lower part of the art hierarchy as it frequently has been, but in the new consciousness of our planetary disaster and danger as we are thinking, the kind of sense of eco-critical engagement with the forms. So you can watch this, one of the joint exhibitions that Harriet Tullow and Judith Tucker had, Low-Lying Poetry and Painting from the Salt Marsh, engages particularly with the plants of this particular area, which I have called these wise plants. Many of them are actually desalinators. They make it possible for this very salinated coastline to sustain forms of life and plant life and ultimately food growing life. So here, Hideaway, painting and poetry from the salt marsh. Again, you have the physical display of the paintings of the works and the angle and focus of Judith's paintings take a whole new direction as her fantastic skill as an oil painter develops. What is interesting is now we've had landscape, we can have different formats of that she experiments with in terms of looking at different kinds of ways of inscribing the sort of the vision onto the earth from an upright human person or looking at the expanse of the earth. But of course, when you come to plants, what is it? So of course, in the 17th century, you have them plant not growing, but in flower vases or as specimens. But how do you find an angle of vision? How do you represent plants, wild plants, plants that are tiny that you would trample underfoot when you're walking along the landscape? You don't notice some of these remarkable creatures, as it were, living forms that are there. But so it's an interesting question to explore here. And I want to just see if I can do this very cleverly, if I can. Let me just see if I can do this. No, I can't. Okay, I need to pause. Recording.
Saltwort. Dry back, grey gold February. Skeletal light living in air flit husks. Cord grass lain low, straw matted over beach. Pool edge fescues, rushes, shelter matted over beach. Pool edge fescues, rushes, shelter, scurvy grass leaves, incipient buds on buckthorn, stripped stark, bronze black. Gutweed, greening April, setting roots, arrowgrass, twist-turning water up, samphire seedlings pushing up on open mud, pushing up globular pink-green across mud, flat salt pans, shallow pools, at the creek's edges, higher according to light, tide, strength, sight, climbing tiny banks, not quite branching, bracting, all stem and stalk, braving tide for bright spring sight. Cordgrass, colonizing sand, underwater, out of water, setting roots, setting mud, flat wedges, curling up to ever-present sea purslane, mycorrhizal roots spreading below, branches creeping sand-pink edges over into May. Broad, lush leaves of sea lavender, buds in tight turned swirl of energy, high over others, pioneering, pushing through, just stalking, not branching, under cord grass flags, green out of dry stalks, slowing water down, building mud, building gutweed, bladderwrack crab corpses stranded over sprawl of roots seedings to tangle with pale, early white-pink thrift flowers within flowers, out of bronze sheath under singing lark sky. Entering in marsh heart of golden creek and pool land, points of white, English sea scurvy grass, one of the first flowers of salt marsh, leaves storing up water, Anglica with a catch and tapering, a single serration distinguishes separation from self. Yellow heart's eye in tiny white flower, some already podded up, rosettes flowing up from crimson stem through grey-green tangle, mosaic purslanes, spreading rosettes, purslane leaves, elliptical, seeming soft but sharp, spreading, covering salt glands, sending salt out into leaves, dropping colour on mud sand. First see.
So I want to end with the final direction of this question of being in the place, on the edge, in the place, and then with the earth. And these two, this is the last painting that was on her, Judith Tucker's easel, and it's an unfinished painting, or perhaps it's not an unfinished painting. It's a absolutely extraordinary direction in her painterly range and skills. And if we go into this work, which is completed, it's just an extraordinary work that was shown at the memorial exhibition curated by Dr. Helen Clark at the School of Design in Leeds, November to December 2024, in which we know that Judith was very excited by the direction of her painting that was being prompted by this engagement with not the grand scale of history, not the grand scale of memorially burdened places, not the grand scale of the outfalls of the canals, indeed of the whole range of the settlement of the Fitties, but close in and close up to the earth. And with these extraordinary surfaces and depths of her painting. And this work, particularly when we get even closer to it, you can see a completely different kind of brushwork, which is developing layers of much thinner washes of color. She always worked in layers. She worked in a very classical form of painting, building up to color from a certain structural chiaroscuro of the base from which she worked, etc. But here we find her developing different kinds of brushes to capture something which is at once depth of space in these works, but also a kind of dynamism of this changing from this close-up looking down and into the tangled mass of these tiny plants that are overlooked and not collected and not painted by Gluck and other great, Rachel Reusch. But here they are. But the brushwork capturing something of the delicacy of their other world and calling us to address this area of life that is itself threatened not by fascism and totalitarianism or ethnic violence or racism, but by us, by our indifference to the fact that we co-inhabit this planet. And I call upon the words of Hannah Arendt, who was perhaps one of the greatest writers about the origins of totalitarianism, the nature of the horror and evil of this destruction of human life, this non-recognition of other humans as humans in living side by side. But also when she said in 1956, when she watched the first spacecraft go into the air, and she thought this was an arrogance and a folly so great, because she reminded us that the only planet on which life has ever existed and evolved to this state that it is in is our planet is Earth, and we are at risk of making it unlivable. And so I see now a much stronger connection between Judith's journey to the coast, to the sense of the edge and where do you belong, and the forces of nature on the sort of on the beach and through the sea, through to her journey in postmemorial studies back to through the photo album to the places from which her mother and grandmother came, and therefore she herself had a footing, a rooting in a world from which she and her like were expelled, and then through to engagements with different parts of the landscapes of Britain, through walking and through her extraordinary 10-year collaboration with Harriet Tarlow in their being literally in the place, walking through the landscape, sitting there, drawing, participating, and then creating these monumental paintings of the plants. And the last exhibition Judith Tucker curated, called Plant Power, is just about to open at King's Lynn, at the Groundwork Gallery at King's Lynn on the 8th of March 2025, and is now in memoriam with Judith Tucker, where this painting, which of course will be a centerpiece. So I hope this has given us a fuller picture of the intellectual and political, ethical and aesthetic trajectory of Judith Tucker's work, and that we will have more detailed exhibitions of the different aspects of her work. But I do see a deep thread running through it of a kind of ethical aesthetic practice that is engaged with time, place, history, and indeed life. And in this, for the last 10 years of her working life, Judith was in a close intellectual collaboration and personal contact and shared life with Harriet Tarlow, whose links to the great poets of Cornwall and to the other aspect of the English coast and another kind of tradition of engagement with land and place that comes through the poetic trajectories they combined in this great project that they shared. Thank you so much for your attention.